The heat of World War II's armored warfare, few encounters captured the brutal contrast of firepower and protection more vividly than when the German 88mm gun crews faced the American M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman. At that time, the German gunners, battle-hardened and confident in their weapon's legendary reputation, had no idea that the tank rolling toward them was unlike the ordinary Shermans they had destroyed so many times before. The M4A3E2 Jumbo was a product of urgent necessity, a battlefield evolution born out of the Allies' desperate need for a tank that could withstand the ever-increasing lethality of German anti-tank guns. When this machine appeared on the Western Front in late 1944, its presence signaled a new phase in the war of steel and fire. The standard German 88mm, which had terrorized Allied crews from North Africa to Normandy, suddenly found itself challenged. What those German crews didn't know, what they could not have known in the smoke and chaos of the battlefield, was that this American tank's frontal armor had been thickened to an astonishing 7 inches. That was nearly double what most Shermans carried, and it transformed the familiar silhouette of the Sherman into something altogether more formidable. Reports from the field would later describe German shells bouncing off its glassy plate, the clang of steel on steel echoing across the muddy fields of France as gunners frantically reloaded, unable to believe what they were seeing. The first units to receive the Jumbo were part of General Omar Bradley's First Army, and their crews soon learned that they had been handed a shield unlike any other in the Allied arsenal. The decision to up-armor the Sherman had come after the costly lessons of Normandy, where Panzer IVs, Tigers, and Panthers had dominated open engagements. American tankers, often forced into close-quarters fights or ambushes, were desperate for a machine that could take a hit and survive long enough to fight back. The M4A3E2's 7-inch frontal armor, combined with a thick, cast steel turret and reinforced side plates, changed the tactical equation. The Germans, relying on the proven penetration of their 88mm Flak 36 and Pak 43 guns, suddenly faced a tank that could shrug off hits from long range. For years, the 88mm had been the terror of the battlefield, the weapon that could destroy anything the Allies fielded, from heavy bombers to Soviet T-34s. Yet, when the Jumbos rolled forward in the winter of 1944, particularly during the Battle of the Bulge, German crews found themselves stunned. After firing at the new Shermans and watching their rounds ricochet, many assumed they had simply missed or struck at an odd angle. In truth, their legendary gun had finally met its match. This unexpected resilience forced the Germans to adapt quickly, relying on ambush tactics, close-range shots, and side attacks to neutralize the Jumbos. But even then, the thick armor gave the American crews valuable seconds that often meant the difference between life and death. In battle reports, tank commanders described how enemy shells slammed into the hull like thunderclaps, denting but not penetrating. Inside, crews could feel the concussion, but they remained alive, shaken yet ready to return fire. The sense of invulnerability emboldened the Americans. The Jumbos were often placed at the front of armored columns, absorbing fire and drawing attention while standard Shermans maneuvered into flanking positions. This tactic proved devastatingly effective, particularly when combined with infantry support and air reconnaissance. German 88mm gun teams, once confident of their supremacy, began to feel hunted rather than hunters. Each new engagement eroded their morale as they realized that the once unstoppable 88 was no longer a guarantee of victory. The psychological shift on both sides was immense. The Americans, long accustomed to seeing their tanks burned and broken, now advanced with newfound confidence, while the Germans, recognizing that armor superiority was slipping away, grew increasingly desperate. The myth of the 88's invincibility began to crumble. German commanders issued new orders emphasizing precision fire, closer engagement ranges, and coordination with panzer units to counter the Jumbos. Some 88mm crews resorted to using specialized high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, but supply shortages and production limits hampered widespread use. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to refine their tactics, exploiting every advantage their armored behemoth offered. The M4A3E2's thick armor, while making it heavier and slower than its predecessors, turned it into an ideal spearhead tank for assaults on fortified positions. Its broad tracks distributed the extra weight well enough to keep it mobile across the muddy terrain of northern Europe. Photographs from the period show these tanks moving through ruined villages, their hulls scarred by enemy fire yet still advancing. To the soldiers following behind, the Jumbo became a symbol of protection, a moving fortress that could lead them through the worst that the enemy could throw. And for the German 88mm gun crews, each encounter with this new Sherman variant was a grim reminder that the tide of war was turning. What they faced was not just thicker armor, it was the embodiment of Allied industrial might and adaptability, the kind of engineering response that would ultimately overwhelm the Third Reich's war machine. As the brutal winter of 1944 settled over Europe, the thick fog of war concealed countless small duels between German 88mm gun teams and advancing Allied armor, but none of those duels carried more shock than the first full-scale confrontations with the M4A3E2 Jumbo. Reports from both sides tell the same story of disbelief. German spotters, trained to identify every contour of enemy armor, initially mistook the Jumbos for standard Shermans fitted with improvised sandbag armor. Only when their round struck and failed to penetrate did the realization dawn that this was something else entirely. The first recorded instances came near Aachen and the Siegfried Line, where American armored divisions used the Jumbos to break through heavily defended zones. When German anti-tank crews fired their vaunted 88mm guns that had destroyed British Churchills in North Africa and torn Soviet T-34s apart on the Eastern Front, they expected their shots to slice clean through. Instead, the shells detonated on impact, spraying sparks and fragments but leaving the American tanks rolling steadily forward. Some German gunners believed at first that their ammunition had been sabotaged or that their guns were misaligned, others simply froze, watching in stunned silence as the unbroken tanks returned fire with deadly precision. For the soldiers inside those Jumbos, the experience was equally surreal. Tank Commander Sergeant William Ross of the 743rd Tank Battalion described one encounter near Stahlberg. "We heard the ping, then the bang, then felt the shake, but nothing came through. The driver just grinned and said, 'That all you got?' That moment of defiance echoed across dozens of battlefields. Crews began to trust their armor in ways unimaginable earlier in the war. The Sherman family of tanks had long carried a grim nickname among American soldiers, Ronsons, after the lighter that lights every time. It referred to how easily they could catch fire after being hit. The Jumbo, however, flipped that reputation on its head. American soldiers soon began to call it the Beast or the Juggernaut. The psychological transformation within Allied ranks was extraordinary. Infantrymen who had once hesitated to follow tanks into battle now crowded behind the Jumbos, confident they could survive the storm of German fire. In contrast, German 88mm gun crews grew restless and anxious. After years of being the predators of the battlefield, they suddenly found themselves prey to the evolving tactics and technology of their adversaries. Intelligence intercepts from late 1944 reveal that German officers were scrambling to understand the new armor. Technical teams examined destroyed or abandoned Jumbos to measure the armor thickness and slope. They discovered that the frontal glacis, nearly 7 inches thick when measured along the angle, could only be penetrated at close range or with specialized ammunition. The Waffenamt, German Army Weapons Office, issued urgent bulletins recommending that 88mm crews aim for the tracks, turret ring, or rear armor. Still, in the fluid conditions of the Western Front, those ideal shots were rarely possible. American forces, knowing the strength of their new tanks, pushed them to the forefront of every major offensive. The 3rd Armored Division, Spearhead, famously used its Jumbos during the Battle of the Bulge to hold critical crossroads against German armor. Even when struck repeatedly by 88mm rounds, several Jumbos remained combat-capable, towing damaged Shermans or rescuing pinned infantry. One field report noted that a single Jumbo took 14 direct hits and still managed to drive away under its own power. Such accounts spread rapidly, boosting morale among Allied troops and spreading dread among German defenders. The legend of invincibility grew, not because the Jumbo was impervious to all fire, but because it could survive what had once been certain death. From the German perspective, the changing battlefield was a nightmare. The 88mm, once a symbol of technological dominance, had been the pride of the Wehrmacht's engineering and artillery corps. Designed originally as an anti-aircraft gun, it had earned its fearsome reputation in North Africa under Rommel, where it destroyed British armor at extreme ranges. It then became the backbone of German anti-tank defenses across Europe. But by late 1944, Germany's industrial and logistical network was collapsing. Ammunition supplies were inconsistent, fuel was scarce, and the quality of steel was deteriorating due to Allied bombings and raw material shortages. Even if the 88mm could, in theory, defeat the Jumbo at close range, getting close enough to make those shots was increasingly impossible. The Allies' air supremacy meant that German gun crews had to operate under constant threat of strafing and bombing. Every time they set up an 88mm gun, they risked being spotted by Allied fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt or the Typhoon. Many crews camouflaged their guns in barns, forests, or ruins, but the psychological weight of fighting an enemy that could attack from the ground and sky simultaneously eroded their confidence. And when their shells bounced harmlessly off the Jumbos, that erosion turned into despair. The propaganda departments on both sides seized upon these moments. Allied newspapers carried triumphant headlines about Super Sherman tanks smashing through the Siegfried Line, while German field bulletins warned soldiers not to underestimate the new American armor. Yet, beneath the propaganda, a grim respect grew among German veterans for the engineering behind the M4A3E2. They recognized that the Americans had learned from their losses and adapted swiftly, a trait that Germany, bogged down by bureaucracy and dwindling resources, could no longer match. Inside the American camps, mechanics worked tirelessly to keep the Jumbos operational. Their heavier armor put immense strain on transmissions and engines, leading to frequent breakdowns. But even with those mechanical challenges, the morale boost was undeniable. Soldiers who had once feared every distant boom of an 88mm gun now advanced with determination, knowing that their steel guardian could take the punishment. The American press celebrated the Jumbo as an emblem of ingenuity and resilience, a visible symbol of the industrial might that was slowly grinding down the Axis powers. For the historians who would later study those battles, the clash between the 88mm and the Jumbo represented more than just a technical matchup, it was a metaphor for the turning point of the war. The Germans, once the masters of battlefield innovation, had reached the limits of their engineering and resources. The Allies, learning from each defeat, had transformed mass production into adaptive warfare. Every shell that failed to penetrate the Jumbo's armor was not just a tactical victory but a statement of industrial supremacy. The German gunners, trained to expect easy kills, began hesitating. That hesitation cost them precious seconds, seconds that allowed the Jumbos to close the distance and return fire. The once terrifying roar of the 88mm became just another sound in the chaos of war. And in those fleeting moments, as the thunder of battle echoed through the frozen fields of Belgium and Germany, the myth of invincibility shifted sides. The 88mm crews never truly understood what had happened that winter, they only knew that the enemy's tanks no longer died as easily as before. History would later explain why. 7 inches of steel had changed the balance of fear. By early 1945, the thunder of the 88mm guns was fading across Europe, replaced by the steady, grinding advance of Allied armor that seemed unstoppable. The M4A3E2 Jumbo, though limited in production numbers, had made an outsized impact on the battlefield, reshaping how both sides viewed tank warfare. German crews who once laughed at the mention of Shermans now spoke the name Jumbo with wary respect. On the shattered plains of western Germany, amid the smoldering ruins of towns like Cologne, Bonn, and Remagen, the last 88mm gun teams fought from desperation rather than confidence. They were still lethal, deadly in ambushes and at close range, but their glory days were behind them. The Allied juggernaut had learned to adapt, the Jumbos led assaults, the infantry covered their flanks, and the skies above roared with Allied aircraft ensuring that no German battery could remain exposed for long. Each confrontation between the 88mm and the Jumbo became a microcosm of the wider war, a clash between a declining but still dangerous empire and a coalition that had mastered the art of industrial warfare. German gunners dug their positions into hillsides and rubble piles, knowing they could get only 1 or 2 shots off before being spotted. When their shells hit the thick frontal armor of a jumbo and bounced away, it was more than just a physical failure, it was a symbol of futility. Even so, many German crews refused to surrender easily. Veterans of North Africa and the Eastern Front carried an almost religious faith in their weapons. The 88 mm, they believed, had never failed them before, and if used correctly, it would not fail now. Some accounts describe 88 mm gun teams waiting in ambush for hours, camouflaging their barrels with branches and snow, listening to the rumble of Allied engines in the distance. When a jumbo finally appeared through the haze, they fired with precision, aiming for the thinner side armor or lower hull. Occasionally, they scored a kill, the heavy shell piercing a weak point and erupting in a burst of flame. But those moments were rare, and the cost was immense. Allied counterfire from accompanying Shermans or tank destroyers was swift and accurate. A single muzzle flash from an 88 mm could draw down the wrath of an entire platoon. Artillery and airstrikes followed, obliterating the gun and its crew. Survivors recalled the helpless feeling of watching their comrades vanish under the weight of Allied retaliation. The 88 mm crews had gone from being feared hunters to hunted men. As one German veteran later wrote, it was as if the war itself had turned its guns upon us. The jumbos, meanwhile, had become the backbone of American armored assaults. Although only about 254 were ever built, they were strategically distributed among the divisions that needed them most. Their thick armor and distinctive, heavy cast turrets made them instantly recognizable to friend and foe alike. Soldiers loved them for their survivability, but mechanics cursed them for their constant strain on engines and transmissions. Still, every commander wanted one in his formation. At Remagen, when the Allies captured the famous bridge over the Rhine, jumbos were among the first to cross, braving enemy artillery and direct 88 mm fire from the opposite bank. Their ability to withstand punishment allowed engineers to secure the bridgehead and push deeper into Germany. German defenders, watching from the hills, fired everything they had, 88s, Panzerfausts, even anti-aircraft guns set to ground mode, but the jumbos refused to burn. Each round that failed to penetrate was a blow to German morale. The stories spread quickly among Wehrmacht ranks. The American tanks cannot be destroyed, whispered soldiers who had seen their best guns bounce off Allied armor. For a military machine that had built its reputation on technological superiority, that realization was devastating. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, the once proud 88 mm gun began to appear less often on the front lines. Many were abandoned or destroyed to prevent capture. Others were turned against Allied aircraft in last-ditch defensive efforts. Those that remained were often crewed by inexperienced conscripts, boys and old men hastily trained to fire at advancing armor. They lacked the skill and precision of the veteran gunners who had once operated the weapon in its prime. The jumbos, on the other hand, were now operated by seasoned crews who had survived months of combat. Their coordination, communication, and discipline had evolved into a deadly rhythm. Every engagement was methodical, scouts spotted enemy guns, artillery softened positions, and then the jumbos advanced, taking the brunt of any remaining fire. The Germans could do little but fall back or die in place. The balance of fear had shifted entirely. Even when an 88 mm managed to destroy a jumbo, it rarely changed the tide of battle. The Americans simply brought more tanks, more shells, and more men. The psychological impact of this relentless pressure crushed what remained of German resistance. The aftermath of these encounters left haunting scenes across the war-torn landscape. Burned-out 88 mm guns lay scattered beside craters and wrecked tanks, their once majestic barrels twisted and silent. Allied war correspondents often photographed jumbos standing triumphantly amid the wreckage, their armor dented but intact, their crews smiling with a mix of pride and exhaustion. These images appeared in newspapers across the United States and Britain, reinforcing the narrative of unstoppable progress. "Steel giants smashed the Reich," read one headline in early 1945. For the families back home, those pictures were symbols of hope, for the Germans, they were grim omens of the inevitable. In towns like Paderborn and Kassel, local civilians recalled the terrifying sound of tank battles echoing through the night, punctuated by the thunderous blasts of 88mm guns. But with each passing week, the American tanks grew bolder, their movements faster, their formations tighter. The Jumbos were no longer just tanks, they were the armored spearheads of liberation, breaking through the final defenses of a collapsing empire. When victory finally came in May 1945, the surviving 88mm crews were among the most somber prisoners of war. They had witnessed firsthand the decline of the weapon they had once worshipped. In post-war interrogations, many admitted that they never truly understood what had changed. The shells just didn't go through anymore, one German sergeant explained to Allied intelligence officers. He had fought since North Africa, serving under Rommel, and could not comprehend how the same gun that had destroyed countless tanks in 1942 had failed so completely by 1945. The answer, of course, lay in the constant evolution of Allied engineering and tactics. The Jumbos represented that evolution in its purest form, a response to the battlefield, designed not by theorists but by necessity. Each inch of added armor, each modification to the turret or hull, had been paid for in blood during earlier battles. The American military's ability to adapt so quickly, producing a new tank variant in the middle of a global war, showcased the industrial and logistical power that Germany could never match. After the war, historians would debate whether the M4A3E2 Jumbo truly changed the outcome of the Western Front. Some argued that it was too few in number to make a decisive difference. Others believed that its psychological and tactical impact far outweighed its limited production. What could not be denied was the symbolism of the encounters between the Jumbo and the 88mm gun. They encapsulated the transition from Axis dominance to Allied ascendancy. In museum exhibits decades later, veterans would stand before preserved Jumbos and 88mm guns, staring silently at the relics of their youth. The old German gunners would trace their hands along the barrels of the 88s, recalling the power they once commanded. American tankers. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May 1945, a strange stillness settled over the battlefields that had once thundered with fire and steel. The shattered remnants of the German 88mm batteries stood like tombstones to a bygone era, their barrels pointing uselessly toward a sky they could no longer command. Scattered among them were the hulking shapes of American M4A3E2 Jumbos, many scarred, dented, or burned, but astonishingly, still recognizable as the machines that had defied the very weapons designed to destroy them. In the ruins of cities like Cologne and Nuremberg, Allied soldiers and war correspondents marveled at the evidence of what had taken place, tank carcasses with shell marks etched deep into their armor, testimonies of the ferocity of the duels that had decided the fate of nations. Engineers and historians descended upon these battlegrounds, eager to study the wreckage. The post-war analysis confirmed what so many German gunners had failed to realize in combat, that the Jumbo's frontal armor, measuring up to 7 inches thick when sloped, rendered the once invincible 88mm far less effective than anyone had imagined. It was an uncomfortable truth for a military that had prided itself on precision and power. For decades, the 88mm had been a symbol of German technological genius, a weapon feared by pilots, tankers, and infantry alike. Yet in the war's final act, it had met its equal not through a miracle of science, but through the relentless logic of adaptation and industrial scale. In the immediate aftermath of victory, the U.S. Army began a thorough study of its armored forces, compiling data on every engagement from Normandy to the Rhine. The M4A3E2 Jumbo stood out as one of the most successful limited-run variants in the entire Sherman lineage. Its heavy armor had saved countless lives, allowing Allied troops to push through fortified zones and survive direct hits that would have annihilated earlier models. Still, the Army recognized that the Jumbo had been a stopgap solution, a wartime improvisation rather than a long-term design. Its additional weight slowed it on the battlefield and strained its mechanical components, but those flaws were forgiven in light of what it achieved. The lessons learned from its performance directly influenced the development of the next generation of American tanks, most notably the M26 Pershing and the post-war Patton series. Military analysts noted that the psychological value of armor, the confidence it inspired in crews and the fear it generated in enemies, was every bit as critical as technical specifications. The Germans, for all their skill, had underestimated that factor. Their 88mm gun, unmatched in pure firepower, could no longer compensate for the morale shift once the enemy stopped fearing it. In Germany, the reckoning was different. Captured 88mm crews faced interrogation by Allied intelligence teams, many of whom wanted to understand not only the weapon's design but also the men who had served it. What emerged from those interviews was a portrait of soldiers torn between pride and disillusionment. Some spoke reverently of the gun, calling it the voice of the Reich, a weapon that had once ruled the desert and the steppe. Others admitted that by 1945 they had come to dread firing it, knowing that every shot might reveal their position and invite instant annihilation. When shown photographs of jumbos that had survived their fire, many were stunned. "It cannot be," muttered one former gunner when presented with a picture of a tank from the 3rd Armored Division riddled with impact marks yet still intact. To them, the idea that an enemy tank could shrug off multiple 88mm hits was inconceivable. German engineers, meanwhile, studied the captured jumbos with a mixture of fascination and bitterness. They respected the design's practicality, the straightforward approach of welding and casting more armor rather than chasing exotic technologies, but lamented that their own production system could never have matched such efficiency. The war had ended before they could field anything comparable in numbers. As Reconstruction began, both nations transformed their wartime relics into instruments of remembrance. In the United States, surviving jumbos were displayed at bases and museums, standing as monuments to the men who fought inside them. Veterans would visit these tanks years later, tracing their hands over the pitted metal and recalling the deafening clangs of 88mm shells. Many described how those encounters had changed them forever, not merely as soldiers but as survivors who had stared death in the face and rolled through it. Their stories filled memoirs and documentaries in the decades that followed, keeping alive the legend of the jumbo as the Sherman that could not be stopped. In Germany, by contrast, the memory of the 88mm became more complicated. For older veterans, it remained a symbol of pride and craftsmanship, but for younger generations, it represented the futility of fighting a war that could never be won. Museums displayed the gun alongside plaques describing both its brilliance and its limitations. Historians emphasize that even the most formidable weapon is only as effective as the strategy and industry that sustain it, a lesson the Third Reich had learned too late. By the 1950s and 1960s, as the Cold War reshaped global politics, military theorists began re-examining World War II's armored duels for insight. The clash between the 88mm and the jumbo became a case study in adaptability. American analysts argued that flexibility and mass production had defeated German specialization. The Germans had created superb individual weapons, the Tiger tank, the Panther, and the 88mm, but their complexity limited numbers and maintenance. The Americans, in contrast, had produced vast fleets of reliable machines that could be upgraded and replaced with astonishing speed. The M4A3E2 was proof of that philosophy. Conceived, built, and deployed within months, it embodied the principle that in modern war, speed of innovation could outweigh elegance of design. Soviet strategists, too, took note. Their post-war tanks, beginning with the T-54, reflected an understanding that survivability and simplicity mattered more than perfection. Meanwhile, Western armies carried forward the spirit of the jumbo into the armored doctrines of the NATO era, emphasizing protection, morale, and logistical support as the cornerstones of armored warfare. Culturally, the legend of the jumbo and the 88mm took on lives of their own. Hollywood films and documentaries romanticized their encounters, portraying duels of courage and defiance. In American narratives, the jumbo became a symbol of ingenuity and determination, the underdog machine that stood up to the German giant. In German literature and cinema, the 88mm was often depicted with melancholic respect, the weapon that had once promised invincibility but ultimately succumbed to the weight of history. Model builders, reenactors, and video game designers would later immortalize both in miniature and digital form, ensuring that new generations continued to relive those moments of industrial drama. Military museums around the world displayed the two side by side, a jumbo with its thick, scarred armor, and an 88mm gun with its long, elegant barrel, each representing a different philosophy of war. Visitors could see, in cold metal and rivets, the story of how technology evolves under pressure and how even the mightiest weapon can meet its match through sheer persistence and adaptation. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of that confrontation lies not in steel but in the human lessons it left behind. The German gunners who manned the 88s were among the most disciplined artillerymen in history, their precision and courage remained unquestioned. The American tankers who faced them embodied equal bravery, trusting their machines and one another under unimaginable fire. Both sides fought not as symbols but as men caught in the momentum of history. When the shells ricocheted off the jumbo's hull, when the 88mm barrels split from overuse, when towns burned and victory or defeat seemed meaningless, all of it spoke to the same truth: technology may define the tools of war, but human resolve defines its outcome. The M4A3E2 Jumbo and the 88mm gun were products of different worlds, each born from its nation's ideals, one from industrial pragmatism, the other from engineering perfectionism. Their clash was not just mechanical but philosophical, a struggle between endurance and precision, between mass and mastery. And in that struggle, the balance of the modern world was decided. Today, standing before a preserved jumbo in a museum, its olive-drab armor still bearing the scars of 88mm impacts, it is easy to imagine the chaos of those long-ago battles, the thunder of the guns, the shouts of the crews, the acrid smell of cordite and diesel. Beside it, the 88mm remains equally impressive, its barrel stretching toward the horizon like a relic of myth. Together, they tell a story that transcends national pride or military statistics. They remind us that every advance in warfare is temporary, every weapon eventually answered by another, and every empire humbled by the passage of time. The German 88mm crews never knew that their most trusted weapon had finally met armor thick enough to resist it. The men inside those jumbos never knew, in the heat of battle, that they were rewriting the very rules of armored combat. History, however, knew. It recorded every clang, every ricochet, every lesson written in smoke and fire. And from those lessons, the modern world inherited not just new machines, but a new understanding, that in the end, resilience, whether of steel or spirit, is what endures when all else breaks.